Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today in the fourth session of the Commonwealth Communities Symposium. Today's event is the fourth in a series of five events addressing key areas of interest for local government staff and elected officials in Massachusetts. We've covered topics ranging from walkability to transit-oriented development, and today we'll be addressing embedding equity in the municipal budgeting process. Please also join us this December for our fifth session on zoning innovations for equity. Please feel free to share this event with your colleagues and networks. All events will be available as recordings, and we'll also be sharing program materials at the conclusion of the series. My name is Catherine Burgess, and I'm the Vice President of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America. This symposium is hosted by Smart Growth America and LOCUS in partnership with the Barr Foundation. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a special thank you to Barr for supporting this symposium and a related program of work. Smart Growth America is a national nonprofit dedicated to advancing equitable, sustainable development. We envision a country in which no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a neighborhood which is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. Land use and development are key to achieving this vision and addressing many of the most pressing challenges of our time, including climate change, racial equity, and public health. This series is also led by LOCUS, the nation's leading coalition of triple bottom line real estate developers and investors advocating for federal, state, and local policies supporting smart growth. We'll be joined today by our LOCUS Massachusetts President, Doug Landry, who was instrumental in putting this symposium series together. Thank you, Doug, and with this, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you to all of our speakers and to everyone for joining us today.
Thanks again, Catherine, and welcome again, everybody. As Catherine said, this was it originally was conceived as a 4-session symposium. And I think, backed by popular demand, we're going to do a 5th session in a few weeks on December 15th. We'll remind you again about that one, zoning reform for equity. But throughout the symposium, again, we have said this in the past, sort of the theme of this whole thing has been our emergent future from COVID and things that we've learned along the way in terms of walkability and transit and small business ecosystems. We're going to learn a lot today about, incorporating equity into municipal budgets and practices. So we hope that you all walk away with tools, some good ideas. We've tried to curate the panelists throughout to get a sense of what's local in Massachusetts, what are some best practices across the country. And this one in particular is going to be really interesting. It is, it's budget season in town meetings and city councils across Massachusetts. And that's an interesting process we'll describe a little bit later on. But it's about putting your money where your policies are, right? And that's what this is going to be with this great group of speakers here. This is the most attendees we've had, or at least signed up for. And again, it's spread across Massachusetts and lots of other folks sprinkled around the country. So please participate. Please put your questions into the chat, and we will get to them throughout the presentations here. So what we'll do is we'll introduce the speakers, the panelists, and then we'll get into a group discussion after everybody introduces themselves. So first on, Jan, if you want to put your camera on. Jan Anderson is the Director of Outcome Budgeting for the City of Detroit. Jan, why don't you say a few words about yourself?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Doug, and for the invitation to this session. I am the Director of Outcome Budgeting, which basically means creating reforms that will align our resources to the results we get. And a big piece of this is how we tell the story and how we hear from our constituents about that. I have 30 years in city government, 20 years as an adjunct professor with a PhD in urban policy. I am a lifelong Detroit resident, and I think that really invigorates a lot of my professional motivation and what I bring to this conversation as well. So thanks again for the invite. Thank you,
Jan. And I'm really looking forward to, like I said, I did my graduate work out in Ann Arbor, and Detroit there's no, unfortunately, there's no better, urban kind of, planning set of issues that I've ever seen in that city. So, there's a lot of perspective there that I think you're going to bring to this conversation. So thank you for being here. You can turn off your camera and we'll bring on Cristania De Leon. Cristania is the co-executive director for the participatory budgeting process. Good morning, Christiana. Cristania.
Hi, good morning. Hi, everyone. I'm Cristania de Leon. Use she, her pronouns. I'm one of 3 co-executive directors at the Participatory Budgeting Project. I'm based in California. The sun is just rising. And I come to this work with a public health background, worked for about a decade supporting public health initiatives all over the state and centering community leadership and policy decisions that most affect them. Natural segue into participatory budgeting. I have a background in international relations and a master's degree in social innovation. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Looking forward to your remarks as well. Next up, Chris Clutchman, if you want to come on camera. Many of you from Massachusetts know Chris, Deputy Director of Community Services for the Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development. You've been involved in so many things across the state, planning initiatives, et cetera. So we're very, very happy you're joining us today, Chris. And why don't you just give a few, few remarks about yourself.
Thanks so much, Doug. It's really a pleasure to be here. I look forward to the time when we're all together in person. I have worked at every level of government, from local government to regional to now at the state, and I also worked for the federal government earlier in my career. So I'm the non-budget person in this session, but I look forward to talking about housing and equity in housing policy in Massachusetts and how we've gotten there.
Thanks, Chris. Great. And Ryan Bowers, come on board. Ryan is the co-founder of Activest. Welcome. Good morning, Ryan. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks so much, Doug. And thanks for everyone for inviting me to this webinar today. Ryan Bowers, go by he, him pronouns, co-founder of Activest, based in the Philadelphia area. And my background is credit analysis from a municipal side, also social science research and management consulting. Been doing racial justice work and diversity, equity, inclusion work with nonprofits, foundations, and local governments for over a decade. And you'll learn a little bit more about Activist, but we're an investment research firm really looking at this intersection of fiscal health and racial justice. So very excited to be here today and great to meet everyone.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Okay, everybody, all the panelists, come on board. We'll get started with the sessions here. Okay, is Ryan coming on? Yeah, there you are. Right. So this next session is going to be sort of a group discussion among the panelists here. But I do want to give some context here for Massachusetts, and I know Chris appreciates this. Massachusetts has 351 cities and towns. We are a home rule state. So every municipality pretty much writes their own rules. Regionalism exists in some areas, not so much in others. We have no counties. We did. They exist now for mosquito control and I think registry of deeds. That's pretty much it. So it's a challenge. And our form of government, if you're a city, that's great. You have a sort of centralized form of government. In towns, you have a thing called town meeting. And I happen to be a elected representative town meeting in my town of Natick for 9 years. And budgeting and trying to get across, the details, the minutia of the process, first of all. And if you're in a position, if you're a citizen and you're trying to promote equity in budgeting, it is not a transparent process in many places. It is daunting. It is public hearings after public hearings. It's the finance committee. It's the board of selectmen. It's town meeting itself. It's a lot of time and effort. And if you're not, if you don't know those tools and those levers, boy, your voice is not heard very loudly. So as we talk about, how do municipalities perpetuate inequity in their policies and practices, which is the prompt question here for this session, I'd like you to sort of, consider how you can open up participation. I know some of you are going to talk more about that, but in Massachusetts in particular, the smaller towns, they may not know they have equity issues. Larger towns do, but there's, you know, embedded processes in the budgeting that just are barriers. And then in the cities where it's a little more streamlined, you know, the politics are a little a little more you know, acute. So anyway, I'll stop there. I just want to kind of set that stage here because I think it's a moment in time where choices like housing, transportation, senior care, et cetera, that are equity issues, you know, need to be considered in the budget season here. So I'll leave it at that. And I don't know who's going to kick off the conversation, but thought I would catalyze it by those remarks. Maybe Chris can take it.
Sure, Doug, happy to do that as the Massachusetts representative, and really appreciate your setting the context for Massachusetts, you know, for my colleagues from across the country about our special 351 cities and towns. For me, in the housing space, one of the things that happened in COVID-19 is that inequity became extremely obvious, right? We have service workers who were very promptly out of work, who all of a sudden fell, like, you know, into a situation where they had no income, having had income, maybe with 1 or 2 jobs, but they had went to zero when hotels closed, when restaurants closed, when watchman jobs, you know, were not available anymore. Buildings downtown Boston became kind of a ghost town. And so all those service workers who live around the greater Boston area and around our state suddenly found themselves without income. I would say that Massachusetts communities did respond. There was some emergency rental assistance. So I've been, again, kind of from the housing space, communities said, hey, what can we do? We want to make emergency rental assistance available. One of the things I think that happened is that the people that were suddenly thrown into the situation, the citizens, the residents, they don't really understand how to access rental assistance because they don't consider themselves as being eligible for things that, you know, for programs, and really just didn't have an idea. So I'd be really interested to hear from my colleagues about how communities can really open up available funding and make it known to folks that funding is available, whether it's through the typical budget cycle or in an emergency situation like we had in the pandemic, to let people know and communicate to people that funding is available.
I guess I can speak as a municipal representative. I want to really set the table about how complex intergovernmental relationships are, right? What is the extent to which the local government can make up for these global disasters, right? What is the extent to which we can augment lost income? You know, fortunately, the federal government did act. It did provide resources, much less than you saw in European countries and the like, and it uses the local government to pass that through or to administer that. Our mayor was out on day one. We were really one of the more aggressive, I think, first to set up testing. You know, we really tried to do what we could do even before the federal government acted with resources, running deficits in the anticipation that they would help. But you have to look at really, there's a point where resources in this country are so obfuscated by this intergovernmental context. You have 300 municipalities in Massachusetts, I think I heard you say. There's 300 jurisdictions in Metro Detroit. So this fragmented government is really part of the problem. People don't, you know, people don't know where to turn. That's not meant to disclaim responsibility, but just to show how difficult this is.
I'll say a lot of what I think Jan and Chris are speaking to are also just national phenomenon that are, yes, of course, exacerbated by COVID. And I think some of the, you know, confluence of recognizing the incredible inequities that have been highlighted through COVID that have been longstanding and a lot of advocacy to address them for years and years and generations and decades. But also meeting with the uprisings for racial justice and recognizing that, you know, in 2020, there was an incredible movement demanding budget justice and transparency. People wondering, well, what's happening? Why are we not seeing relief? Why are we still sort of wondering how we're going to pay our bills? Where is the support coming from? And, what are we going to do about these inflated budgets in some portions of our municipal spaces that could be redeployed to really support life-affirming and supportive practices for our communities. And so I think there's been huge demands just generally to really think about who has a say in making some of these budget decisions. We see huge influxes of federal resources coming into municipalities that deal with COVID recovery, for example, and really thinking about who is able to influence where they go, who decides. And I think there's incredible demands to think about when it comes to, for example, COVID recovery, COVID relief, where are the voices of people who are affected by medical racism and disparities related to social determinants of health, who present comorbidities, those who are disproportionately impacted by COVID, who are frontline workers, and those who are facing financial, food, housing insecurity in general. We have American Rescue Plan Act funds that are moving into communities. I think it's a huge opportunity to think about this ongoing conversation. And I think that we have to not so much rely on community members to do all the work to be engaged and be at the meetings and have a say and read through intentionally really challenging budget documents that I don't even know all of our electeds read. They're really dense and really challenging to comprehend. And I think that there is sort of an expectation and a need for our municipal leaders and formal decision makers to really think about how they also take initiative in making this work more transparent and more accessible. How they also engage in conversations around shared decision making and accountability that's really critical to facilitate robust community processes, but also bring justice and bring transparency into spaces, as opposed to kind of expecting that our community members will have to just kind of fight to figure it out. And I think there's definitely a movement and demands to see what municipal spaces can do to really offer the information, the data transparency people are really needing and asking for.
And I'll build on that. Thank you, Christiana. One of the things that what you're saying makes me think about is, I'm a parent of a teenager, and one of the things that as I talk to other parents of teens, kind of realize is that a lot of times, when issues come up, you might realize that your relationship with your teenager is kind of too frayed at the time that you actually need to actually deal with a crisis or an issue that's at hand. It's not something that you can fast track and get ahead of if you've waited so long. And I think as as a kind of local government leader, one of the things that you realize is and we've worked with over the past year and a half, working really with local government budget directors, finance officers, thinking about incorporating equity into their budgets. There's so many people that as we talk to them, folks are at Equity 101. These are kind of new conversations, new muscles, new dynamics that, from a technical standpoint, people hadn't had to necessarily deal with or build those competencies, and are caught kind of flat-footed in realizing we actually don't have a great perspective on both the voice and needs as expressed by themselves by our residents, particularly those who have been on the margins. And sometimes the margins might mean a majority of residents or a large population. And so kind of catching up, what does that mean to develop those competencies and see them as, these soft skills that, we're realizing they're not just kind of secondary, ancillary kind of capacities. These are core capabilities. These are technical skills that are in kind of high demand. So I think just understanding that some of our of our leaders are from administrative leaders to electeds are a little bit it's hard to admit when we're a little bit behind in understanding, engaging, and learning from our communities, particularly those that are might not be talking in the softest tones and are frustrated and angry, rightly so. So I think part of the work is understanding really where we are, and I think for us it is the fact that these have been tensions and kind of conditions that have been left and overlooked for generations, and a lot of times I think if you took a kind of a poll or survey from different parts of your community, there's been dissatisfaction kind of growing and brewing for generations, and a lot of that kind of comes to a boiling point when things are at a crisis. It's finally time to start paying attention to that. So it's a lot. We've been having a lot of conversations on how do you kind of reorient yourselves to learning these new languages, speaking these new, building these new muscles that are not just additional supports, but actually core to how you engage, how you listen, and how you work as a municipal leader.
I think of what you're saying as resiliency, and it's both often that's said in terms of physical infrastructure, right, and having the ability to withstand climate and that kind of thing, but it also is a social infrastructure. And having that dialogue and, in an open democratic society, all the pieces you're describing, we have to work on that, not just in a crisis time. And that also becomes the reason a lot of people don't want to entertain equity, is because then you find yourself in a state of perpetual crisis. Well, we can't deal with that now, and people have the fear of redistribution. It's just becomes its own beast. You have to be process oriented. You have to really build that infrastructure. Think systemically,
I agree, Jan.
So,
Go ahead,
sorry, good.
I was going to say I agree, and I think to make that happen, there needs to be a sustained investment in building relationships with community leaders. And I think oftentimes when we work with municipal departments or agencies, there's this tension. We're like, well, we made a plan and then we had a city meeting and everyone's mad about the plan. And so now we're just fighting with residents. I hate this. And I think that there's a recognition that if we want to be resilient and we want to have what we need in times of prosperity, in times of crisis, in times where things are really thriving, we have to invest in engaging our community expertise, their lived experience. We have to understand that they are partners in this work, but right and true partners, not tokenized partners. And we have to be willing to cultivate that trusted relationship over a course of time so that we're maybe jointly building those plans together. And when things are really tough, we can rely on each other and each other's expertise to really build that resilience, Jan, I think that you're speaking to, that is so essential for the success of all of us to really thrive, and kind of move and build together. Go ahead, Ryan, sorry.
Yeah, as a kind of Black American, there's a pretty widely shared sentiment that this is the part where democracy struggles, where it's kind of, as we're trying to build that more perfect union, it's biased against, originally biased against those who weren't kind of white male landowners. And now it's biased against those who aren't, represent the majority of a population in the city or have access to the social networks, the relationships, and the capital to really, to have the freedom to be at, and the kind of free and available time to be at municipal meetings, to have those kind of core relationships, to be in that boys club. And that not only is, it's not just unfortunate, it doesn't just feel bad, it has material impacts to your life outcomes. And I think about, how do we, and this isn't to talk about, just abandoning democracy. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying, how do we strengthen it and actually have this kind of clear-eyed view of really where it falls apart and who it doesn't meet. Frankly, I don't think our democracy was designed to support my people. We weren't even whole people at the building of our country, and a lot of those parts of our kind of fabric that started the federal government and really play out on a local level, that we still haven't dealt with them. We're still feeling, kind of a sense of, from the perspective of Black and Brown people, this country wasn't made for us, and it still doesn't work for us. We still see the same dynamics, and as you know, in every municipal, not every, but a large parts of the country, there's outcomes and kind of well-being indicators that were where they were, 100 years ago or 50 years ago, or even worse than that. So I think having these conversations to say, really, where are we succeeding and failing from the perspective of the people that are impacted the most? And then where our solutions should be coming from are those kind of closest to the problem. Now, I think that's a stance that and a kind of commitment that I have, but that's not, unless that's the the perspective of the majority of voters or our elected officials or appointed officials if you're in receivership or you know, in one of those really difficult situations. You know, that's the reality that we're dealing with. So, you know, part of what we talk about at Activist is, you know, who else cares about this? And from our perspective, we talk about this not only leads to bad outcomes for, you know, residents, has material impacts, but from just a fiscal standpoint, it's terrible fiscal practice. You know, these, you know, having parts of your, you know, residents really feeling, you know, being disconnected, you know, as we talk about, you know, an ounce of prevention is really, you know, worth so much more in terms of, you know, getting ahead of the problem. I think for, you know, really trying to think about what are the, you know, dollars and cents costs of our inequities, how do they show up in our budgets, and really what savings and return on investments could we realize if we were truly incorporating all of our residents into our democracy. I think that's really the frontier of where I'd love our kind of equity and inclusion conversations to go, not just about how people feel, but really the material differences that could be made from those budgetary and investment choices.
And I really appreciate the, and I'm really interested, the presentations you guys are going to hear from these folks are going to be very interesting about the budget perspective, and to bring it to the land use and housing perspective, not just COVID, but for the last 5 years, I would say, there's been a rising understanding of the inequities by zoning. Zoning's been in place in America for about 100 years, and it has served to be exclusionary. Richard Rothstein's book, Color of Law, if you have not read it, just lays it out. It is, as a land use planner for over 30 years, it is just gut-wrenching to see the explicit denials that happen to people of color, to immigrants, to all sorts of folks by zoning. And so I would say in the space that I work in, there has been a rising understanding of these inequitable policies that local, you know, it's one of the things that local governments do. Local governments do zoning. The federal government mostly stays out of zoning other than some Supreme Court cases and case law. But I'll be talking about that a little bit more in my presentation, but I would just want to get that into the conversation here, and that, you know, that's certainly inequity in government policies. And again, with the 351 towns and cities in Massachusetts, each one of those jurisdictions is creating and debating zoning and zoning amendments. And so I'll be talking about how Massachusetts land use reform this past year is looking to change that.
I really think land use is key. You know, the ability to set an arbitrary border that says, here's where this municipality ends. Even though one regional economy has produced the whole infrastructure, the ability to define and say and say, we're this, we're north of 8 Mile, you're south of 8 Mile, you know, that has been a key piece of this. And that also, I will add, Ryan, to the point about those closest to it, that has been a big part of the people in the city. I'm sure it's true of all the big cities, and I can speak for Detroit. We feel like we're on the side of the Lord, if you will, that we are the one place that everybody can come to. And there's a place for everybody in Detroit, and come on, we need you. But that means that we're the ones responsible for getting this right. That's the view that I come from. And it's true of the public sector as well, that the public sector is gluing us all together in a way that all these private energies don't, right? I think the land use is the key to overcoming a lot of these things, absolutely.
This is Doug again. Just, you know, Ryan, I really tracked with what you said about Equity 101 and, you know, bringing people into the conversation. And with the land use question, you know, you can open up any comprehensive plan in this state, I'm sure lots of other places, and you talk about community values, and there's things like we want open space, we want to protect our historic resources, we want to have good schools and families, but, you know, there's not an equity lens on a lot of that. And, you know, so to the land use issue, you know, you will find in this state, you know, the blueprint for spatial spatial use, right? Housing, where housing goes. And so, if you start to incorporate community values into the planning process and diversity and equity issues into the planning process, you're going to come up with a land use plan, hopefully, that is reflective and corrective of some of these things. Jan, I'm interested in the nimbleness question here in terms of government and how to solve some of these issues. In Massachusetts, Framingham was a town for all of its life until 5 years ago. And it was actually the largest town in America in terms of town government, form of government, and population. It's 80,000 people who live in Framingham, something like that. Correct me if I'm wrong, Chris. But they decided that town meeting, and that really highly participatory form of government wasn't working, and they went to a city form of government. So I'd love to hear your perspective in particular about, is decentralized, highly participatory government good at decision making, or is it better to have centralized, more executive kind of decision making?
Oh, boy, isn't that the money question. I've spent 30 years of my career working on organizational structure. That's a lot of what I have worked with. We in Detroit have what's considered the strongest of the strong mayor systems, meaning we've had an executive who controls, all of these key seats. In the last decade, we have migrated from that. We have had some charter revisions that give city council kind of a co-say on some key roles. Our last proposed charter this summer really would have increased a lot of these oversight boards. We actually elect the police oversight board, for example. That I think is a healthy tension to, I think making periodic changes is good. It's a healthy dynamic to question and to go back and forth a little between centralizing and decentralizing. But I would say generally that if you're in crisis mode, that centralizing is the quickest way. That's why we ended up insolvent, is because we didn't have that cutter. We didn't have that general who, to balance the budget, who could end up saying this is what we're going to do. But of course, the reason we got to that is because we hadn't leveraged all of our, we hadn't retained our base, right, and leveraged all of the resources in our population as well. So you're never going to have one way. You're always going to have some kind of balance. And I do think it's a healthy dynamic between it. I'm not in favor of changing the charter, wholesale changes every decade, but I do think we should be revisiting it and always thinking that, always asking those questions, asking them in a broad public dialogue.
Thank you for that.
One thing just to add to the conversation around land use, we have some colleagues that really take a very critical view of kind of land use and planning, and they use a kind of framework called Plantation Capitalism, and it really looks at how essentially framing part of the historical use of local governments in the U.S. And largely for facing as an issue that communities of color have had to deal with, of really being a machine that kind of takes value from people and extracts that for in its worst case for private use, and really much like a plantation system, and it's both being able to extract value, use liens, and being able to even kind of leverage debt for through today tax increment finance districts, and kind of other means to really support private development at the expense of oftentimes our most marginalized communities. And one of the things that points to, I think, for us is in finance, the thing that you don't want to have often is kind of a historical analysis. things are a lot easier and simpler if you have a kind of a historical view of, planning, land use that really starts with, all right, where are we today and where do we want to be in the future to be more equitable? The conversation gets much more difficult if you look at where have we excluded people this, last year, last decade, and the prior one, when, when no one was talking about equity, when, things were truly, run by a kind of a much less diverse group of people, when, civil rights were, not really as important as they are today. And once you start going back further in time and trying to start really accounting for some of these inequitable practices that have been kind of layered on top of each other, which each subsequent administration, what we realize is that the costs of those things start to really increase kind of exponentially. And so obviously we don't have unlimited budgets at the local level, but it is really important to start saying, how do we look historically at the accumulated costs of our exclusionary practices, our kind of our most predatory municipal practices. And really, if we're kind of starting to account for that, what does that mean for future planning in terms of how blatantly kind of discriminatory and racist our local government legacies are in so many communities? And I think that's the next level of conversation that I'd love a lot of our diversity, equity, inclusion work to take, is not just starting from a point of today, or even like in public finance, we go back sometimes 5 or 10 years in a kind of financial analysis, but to go back into the 90s, into the 80s, where are so many families, when redlining tools were still used, you don't have to go back to the 60s for that. And I think that would be a really fresh and new conversation and a take on how we're really looking at who's been impacted and what's the cost.
Great. That's a great sort of, carryover theme to the next session coming up in December about zoning reform too, Ryan. So this has been great. This sets up very well for the case studies to follow here. So each of you are going to present in more detail some of your work. So we're going to start off with Jan, and you are going to provide us a case study on the city of Detroit. So if everyone else could go off camera, and we'll leave it to Jan.
Thank you very much, Doug. I just broke up on my computer audio, so I hope I can be heard.
You're loud and clear. You're good.
I came back just in time for my piece of it. I just have a couple of things I'd like to show you, and I'd like to really put some flesh on this case study of Detroit and how we are trying to respond to some of what's been raised and to this change, enormous change of the last couple of years. So on the first slide, I've got a map. If you would advance to the next slide. I'd like to show this map to everybody in the world because this really sets the context for the exploitation of what was once the greatest manufacturing center, probably in human history, at a time when resources were centralized as they were. If you look at the map, in the brightest color starts at the historical point, 1890, and every 30 years, this map is showing the increasing consumption of land through development. So this is Metro Detroit growing from 1890 to 2010. So what you see is that we continue to develop. It's not untrue in any urban center in America. I mean, this is not unique to Detroit, right? But what you see is that we keep building the roads, the water pipes, the electric, all of the physical infrastructure. A lot of this was done to sell housing and commercial properties to people. It was done before there was demand. It was done before there were people there. We continued to expand on that. DetroitOgraphy.com, by the way, has some terrific maps if you're interested in a better history of Detroit. But this, to me, is the start of this conversation. because what you see, and I called out the infamous 8 Mile border, which in Detroit, 8 Mile is the north border of the city, and that's everything. That's why Eminem called the movie 8 Mile, because that tells the story. But you see how it's been eclipsed in the post-war years. And the growth has been unbelievable. And again, this map only takes us to 2010. I've marked where 2020 we really have developed off of the shown counties here. So what does that mean to have continued development in a region without population growth in 6 decades? Right? Metro Detroit in 1960 had 3,548,000 people. And in 2020, it registered 3,530,000 people. The same number of people, and look at the amount of space that's being consumed. That drives up the cost. Just inherently, there's fewer people per mile of water pipe, right? It drives up your costs right there. Well, what's happened with that development is exhaustive, and I might add exhausting, municipal and corporation, which makes a highly competitive environment where you have suburbs that had worked to poach tax base from the city, to recruit companies to come leave their Detroit headquarters instead of reinvesting. And they did it to go to the proverbial greenfield. So that's how we ended up with this quilt of municipal jurisdictions. In Michigan, you only need 2,000 people to become your own city. So you had Detroit, which was at 1,670,000, I think it is, in 1960. So we were half of the metro area in 1960. You had Detroit just being poached because a company could leave, pay almost no taxes because there was not existing infrastructure to support where they moved to. So that competitive dynamic also was against a backdrop of national, globalization of manufacturing that really led to a restructuring. Of course, we were auto-centric. So you had auto industries, by the 1950s, what once was dozens of auto companies was down to 4. And the east side of Detroit, where I live, lost 70,000+ jobs in a 4-year period from 1956 to 1960. 70,000 jobs out of the east side of Detroit due to Packard, Hudson Motors, and all these companies being consumed. That depopulated core that I was talking about, and the census, tragically, the 2020 census shows us even further, another 10% loss. That 1.9 million we were estimated at in 1955 is down to 630,000. And there's reason to dispute that number. I think we all know things didn't go well in 2020. But that aside, the number is not good, that aside. The net result of all this change, some of it just maneuverings, some of it just sort of the natural result of unregulated capitalism. All the devastating impact of this has really been borne by Black Detroiters and by people, working, marginal, skilled level people, lower income people. That's the context, to Ryan's point about going back and telling this story. That is what has to be understood. There are people in Detroit today, Metro Detroit, who are convinced that it's the behavior of Detroiters that led to Detroit's demise, when the problem of Detroit is what is gone, not what is there. So the next slide, please. The next slide really is the aftermath of this. Disparities are a way of life. Disparities are a standard operating procedure. And I don't think that's just in Metro Detroit. I think the reckoning of the last year is just all of the ways we extract exploit, if you will, people of color, lower income, the whole bit. But disparities, that's really where we're at, is this acknowledgement, this festering understanding of those of us, and again, I speak as a lifelong Detroiter. We did a survey. I'll tell you in a minute about my initiative, the Outcome Budgeting Initiative, but it included this 2020 citizen survey and a whole outreach of meetings to try and flesh out a strategic framework, to try and hear from people about the meaning of public safety, the meaning of a vibrant, beautiful city, economic opportunity, the whole like, right? We took these broad outcomes, had this survey, and it was very interesting that the biggest thing, a lot of the survey was open-ended. People were able to kind of sift through our current services and prioritize that sort of it. But a lot of this was focused on hearing from people. And we heard every which way about the inequities in our city. So I, who come from a perspective of city versus suburb, heard people talk about within the city, the trouble that there's the Black neighborhoods aren't getting reinvested in. Only people with income, you're gentrifying and serving only people with income. Tax abatements, business, and of course we've had some high profile ones at that. The downtown, right? Disparities is a big piece of the story. I should add that we did another round of meetings when the American Rescue Plan was passed. 65 public meetings in 30 days. That's new for us. In my 30-year career, we've never done that. 65 meetings. We also asked people to prioritize. Hey, we've got this money, where should we invest it? And fully 2/3 of the respondents said it's got to deal with intergenerational poverty or rebuilding neighborhoods. Now, these weren't the most scientific of surveys, but again, they were meant to foster this public dialogue. And I can tell you loud and clear that the result is people see disparities are a way of life, and we don't like it. Another piece of the disparities question, how our charter commission that I mentioned before really was proposing a lot of ways of hard coding or defining into the charter these remedies. And we did pass a ballot question to enable a reparations task force, by the way, but the charter commission was really looking to put that in the charter. And that really raised a question. A lot of people, there's some disagreement. Wait, is inequity about what's in the law? Is it about what your Constitution, which is what a charter is? Is it what the Constitution says? Does that make it equitable? If it's in there, does that fix the problem? So, is it law or is it custom? And values that people have. There's all of these different iterations that we have to go through to really define what is equity going to look like, right? Is it going to just be a process and efforts, or is it going to be results? There were some people who said, no, the charter, that doesn't guarantee that this gets fixed, So it's an interesting discussion we're having. I'll mention as well, federal grants, philanthropy. This has been an exploding revenue source for the city. Of course, the federal money that we've talked about, the ARPA money, but philanthropy, some of these old institutions that got their wealth in our manufacturing boom, it's just been hundreds of millions of dollars coming into the city. So the Strategic Neighborhood Fund has identified 12 of these corridors that they're really working to redevelop streetscapes and augment, redevelop commercial opportunities and the like. But that raises the geography question. Why that neighborhood? Why not my neighborhood? You know, it's really an interesting dynamic, and I think everybody understands the zones and the targeted incentives. You know, how do we decide for the good of the city, for the collective benefit, and pick an area that's the most intact, or do we go to the areas where people have just lost everything? And we have, in a city that's lost over 90% of its commercial base since 1950, and about 93% of its manufacturing base since 1950, there are lots of areas that are thinned out, if you will. So what are we doing? The next slide really gets to these pieces of, you know, this budget reform. You may have heard of outcome budgeting as something City of Baltimore pioneered, and City of Austin, you know, those are our cohort cities, but there's all sorts of jurisdictions. We're really just talking about tailoring our investment decisions, right? Who gets what in the budget to the results? Who benefits? Who gets what? Who benefits? You know, it's all about measuring how you spend your money. Public engagement is a central piece of this. We can sit in the city hall and say, here's the right outcome, here's the services we're going to do, but the public, it has to meet the expectations of the public. You have to have city, you know, that's the nature of an open democracy. I guess today we have to explain how democracy works, don't we? But that's the nature of the beast, is that the government is for the people, by the people. You know, it's really seamless. So this reinvigorates the budget process to go out and really, you know, we had a whole host of new meetings going to each district. We used to have one annual public budget meeting. Now we have them, that one in the fall, it's more educational. And in January, when the budget questions are being finalized for a March presentation to City Council, we go out to each district. So public meetings are a big part of it. I think Zoom is going to help. You know, I look forward to the day of being back with people, but I think we're always going to live stream now. You know, it does help more people get involved. We had over 10,000 views on our live streams. So public input, though, you can't just go to a meeting. You've really got to sift what people are talking about. The service question, you know, how do you define blight removal? Our mayor did a lot of work on that. We have a very successful blight bond passed by the on a ballot question in 2020, and that really caused that to be defined publicly, because the mayor said, I'm going to demolish all of these eyesores, and the city council, through pressure from community organizations, said, you have to save what you can. We can't, we have, by the way, lost 1/3 of our properties since 1960. So that's how thinned out the city is. But people said that has to include stabilization of housing. You can't just demolish wholesale. So defining what's a service, is blight removal demolition, or is blight removal fixing up a unoccupied house? Of course, police, what does the police deliver? We had a tremendous amount of energy here, as all major cities saw last year, with, you know, months. I don't know what the record was, but they protested for 3-4 months in a row. So defining that, we did end up with a mental health initiative where we partnered with the Detroit Wayne Mental Health Network, I think it's called, to respond, you know, differently, not guns a-blazing for those type of calls, you know. So public input, it's hard to quantify, but that opening up the channels and hearing more about it, you know, that's really what we're talking about here. And of course, the third piece of that is having better information flow, so people don't have to pour through those 300, 600 page documents. The next slide shows an example of that on the right, that we now are trying to introduce infographics, which at least will show people over time, how much it costs to do, a street light, a mile of road, the bus. No bus system pays for itself with fares, and of course we're still running a municipal bus system, which we might be alone in that endeavor. But we're trying to really advance information in a way that tells a very complicated story. Very complicated. What does the city do? What other we have all these overlapping jurisdictions that provide services in the same space. I just want to add in closing, we have a mayor who speaks about equity. Not all mayors do. And you could probably Google his 2017 Mackinac Island Conference address. It's really one of the great things I've seen. That gets back to the point about, speaking the truth. And the truth is that what's left Detroit is more of a problem, if you will, than, what is left in Detroit, right? It's the regional urban sprawl. He has also, I think, been inspired by a lot of the 2020 movements, and his program priorities state explicit equity goals. His Skills for Life program would be something you can look up. We also have a city council that's taken great leadership. Christine, I've been all over your website because we were going to do a participatory budgeting pilot, and a lot of things got derailed in 2020. But council has also passed an ordinance for community outreach and mandating, reporting and activities. And we did all sorts of public meetings, metrics. There really is a lot of initiatives. It's not where it needs to be, but it's a glacier that's been redirected, if you will. Doug, I think that probably completes the epic of Detroit in 15 minutes.
We could do 4 sessions on Detroit, Jan, right? I mean, it's amazing. For me, the infographic and the way to communicate, when you've got disparate and sort of balkanized, budgets and governments and competing agendas, laying it out in an infographic that doesn't, sets that platform and equalizes it, that's a great communication tool to kind of get those messages across. At my peril, I'm going to ask you a question, and I know it's unfair, but 30 seconds, okay? Because I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this question about revenue and casinos. We went through, in Massachusetts, we had our day with casinos. There are a couple of them around the state, one in Everett, Mass, one in Springfield, a couple of slots parlors. And I know Detroit, does have a casino down there. Just spend 30 seconds on fiscal impact of the casinos in Detroit and how you see that playing into this conversation.
Well, I can't speak to the economic impact because that's a broader question that a lot of people have discussed. Does it displace other activities, et cetera? But the fiscal impact is that the casino revenue has saved us on many. I mean, we are, again, 93% of your tax base is gone, 2/3 of your people and more of your jobs. So we have 3 casinos, and we did have some community benefits, where they do invest, and they have provided some tourist draw, so I think they saved us. We also added online sports betting, which offset, it was key. We're not back to where we were pre-pandemic, but it did help us in that regard. So fiscally, I can't speak to the moral ills or the economic,
Okay. I know that was unfair. I'm sorry.
Oh, good question.
Great presentation. All right. So let's queue up Kristania, please. And Jan, thank you. Yep. And Kristania is going to talk us through the participatory budgeting project and the work she's doing out in sunny California and elsewhere. Thank you.
Sure thing. Let me get my PowerPoint going. All right, how's it look to everybody? Looking okay?
Yeah, we can see your next slide, but that's okay. Keep going.
Oh, you can see the actual.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Okay, we'll just go for it here. Okay,
There you go. Perfect. Yep.
great. Try to get these windows out of the way. Okay, so hi. Lovely to be here with everyone. Cristania De Leon. Can y'all see these like GoToWebinar things? Should I close them out? We're going with it.
Yep, you're good. You're good.
Okay, cool. Okay, so really grateful to be here. My name is Cristania De Leon. You share pronouns, like I've said before. I'm one of our co-executive directors with the Participatory Budgeting Project, and I'm really grateful to be able to talk to you all about participatory budgeting, what it is, and how it kind of interacts with this question about equity in our municipal budgets and practices. So just a bit about the Participatory Budgeting Project, or PBP. We were founded in 2009 alongside the first ever PB process in the United States, and have really dedicated our work to leading, supporting, helping implement, researching, advocating for participatory decision making all over the US and Canada. The core of our work is really centered around ensuring that members of community are able to work together to decide how to spend portions of our public budgets. And we have staff primarily based in New York and Oakland, now with COVID, a bit all over, but we do really focus on processes across the US and Canada. So what is participatory budgeting? At its core, most simply put, participatory budgeting is a democratic practice in which community members work together to directly decide how to spend part of a public budget. So it's certainly underneath the framing of participatory democracy. It's very much aligned with solidarity economy practices. And I think sort of if we think back at the premise of this entire sort of session, spoiler alert, when we're asking ourselves, how do we incorporate equity into our municipal budgets and practices and policies, the answer that participatory budgeting offers is that we work with community members. We support them and we center their decisions and their lived experiences, their needs that specifically come from them. And we invest alongside processes that build with our community members and not necessarily building for community members. So that's where we're headed. I want to recognize that there are a lot of ways we can engage community members in making decisions about our public budgets. And depending on the intervention or strategy that we use, the role of community can be very different. So lots of things that we do can, engage community members in a listening role. We can, do consultations, but participatory budgeting is really centered and oriented around direct decision making. It is not a survey, it is not a consultation, it is a process that results in the full breadth of our community members able to directly decide what investments are being made with resources that we have in our communities. So how does it work? I will say that, no two PB processes are the same because no two communities are the same. But generally speaking, participatory budgeting is comprised of 6 key steps or phases, and that can be modified or tailored to a particular community context. The first thing we'll do before we kick off a PB process is really think about what are the resources that you are going to be allocating through participatory budgeting. It's important to think about, when we work with folks specifically in municipal and budgeting spaces, you'll be hard pressed to find anyone who's like, I've got extra money sitting around to do a participatory practice. What we really emphasize is that PB is not about finding new money to do a process on the side. PB is really at its core thinking about where in the budget decisions you already have to make. Are you able and willing to allow for robust community engagement and community leadership in that work? It's not sort of a new thing to do, it's a better way of doing what you already have to get done. So once you've set aside a portion of your budget that you will allocate through PB, the first step is that you'll work with community members to design your process. Like I mentioned, there's these phases, but they can adapt and change based on your particular needs. And so the first real step is in convening a community steering committee that represents your community or over-represents for folks who are traditionally left out of decision making to really design what this process will look like in your specific context. So they'll get together and they'll grapple and think about you know, who should be eligible to vote in this process? You know, where are we going to be doing intentional outreach? What will it look like for us? You know, will there be age limits? How will we have language justice as a part of this work? They'll be the core of really baking in equity into the process and really thinking about, you know, the big kind of vision for this work. I will say that for participatory budgeting, you'll hear words like vote, you'll hear a couple of things. Unlike more traditional sort of voting processes, there's no reason why anyone is inherently ineligible to participate in participatory budgeting, whether it deals with documentation status, if they are formerly or currently incarcerated, if they find themselves in hospital, if they are under the age of 18. It is a broad opportunity to allow for folks to really engage in the process deeply and really robustly, really intentionally. Then we have sort of this vision for what we're going to do. We cut out to the full community in accordance with those rules. And we pose the question to our community members. We say, what should we be doing with these resources? And that's done through a whole range of community engagement strategies that people feel will work for them. So we'll see now during COVID, we had to kind of adapt to maybe not doing huge assemblies in person and having fewer in-person meetings, but relying more on online tools. How do we actually bring in equity in that? How do we think about digital divide? What's going to work for people who aren't native English speakers? All of those things are kind of brought in, but we have a really broad opportunity for folks to say how they think this funds should be spent. If there are restrictions on the funds, it's made incredibly clear. If there are like sort of boundaries around what kinds of proposals can actually, be invested in with these resources, it's all incredibly transparent. But we ask our communities to dream, to really vision for what can be done to meet their most pressing needs. Then we kind of leave with a whole host of ideas. But we can't just fund ideas. We have to develop them into strong proposals. So this phase typically takes the longest, and it's about taking ideas and really seeing what's feasible, what's going to meet our greatest needs, where are we going to see equitable impact, and how do we actually build out a sort of scaffolding, a whole picture around an idea to really create a proposal that's incredibly strong and fundable. So our community partners typically will have volunteers take on this portion of the work. Hopefully they are also paid and compensated for that labor and expertise. But they will take these things and they will work with other community partners, they'll work with local nonprofits, and they'll work with municipal leaders and folks within departments and agencies to think about how much does this cost? Where can it go? Are there other things that maybe are already happening that do this? We don't need to fund it through PB, but we do need to make people aware of that process or that project that does exist. They get really, really specific and highly vet these proposals alongside folks who can offer that additional detail and research. And it's really rigorous because we don't want anything to move on to a ballot for a vote that can't actually be funded. And we want folks to really know what they're investing in. So those finalized proposals have been whittled down, are then moved on to a ballot for a vote. Again, the full community is invited to vote for the projects that they think best align with their needs and their interests. And then we fund the winning projects up until the point where the funds run out. And so we implement those winning ideas depending on the kinds of money you're using. It can be something that's a one-time investment that be implemented really immediately. It can be something that people might see in 3 to 5 years. But it becomes a sort of a piece of working with community to really implement their vision. And then you'll see this arrow kind of continues. The process then is evaluated. It's really important to evaluate it to assess how efficient and how equitable your outreach was. People are really using what's kind of coming out of the investment that they're making, and you run it on a cycle. PB isn't intended to be kind of a one-time kind of tried it once, that was cute. It's intended to be a new way of budgeting and making decisions that progresses every year on a cycle alongside your budget calendar and allows for more community engagement and community leadership in the budget decision-making that you're carrying out. One thing I will say, just to kind of emphasize here, is that PB really is about sort of a portion of budgets, but the kinds of funds that you choose will make a difference. I'll talk about that in a moment, but you want to think about, we have examples where it's, really limited capital funds that can only go towards very specific projects, but there's also a whole range of other budgets that can offer a lot of breadth of opportunity for communities, really robust engagement, and brainstorming, thinking, dreaming, visioning, and naming those specific needs that they have. So if you can spend it, you could probably do PB with it, I guess is the response when we think about what kinds of budgets can work. But we're talking about, budgets at any kind of level. Federal resources also work. Block grants have been used for PB allocation. Non-governmental resources, I will say people are more and more doing participatory budgeting within their organizations. You might, if you're interested in exploring this, consider if you would like to practice participatory budgeting within your agency or department, so that you can kind of get a sense of the practice and what that can look like and yield. Discretionary funds, school funds, public agency budgets, and then of course, I think no surprise, police and carceral budgets are an increasing area where people are really demanding to really think about if we're looking at divesting from policing, for example, who is choosing where it's invested? What does that look like? And what is the role of impacted community, and specifically Black community members, in having a say in articulating what they need, either in a reparations framework or in another way to think about reconciliation, healing, and actually rebuilding life-affirming institutions in lieu of carceral and police spaces. So these are just some examples, but it's a very broad array of budgets that can be used of all sizes. When we think about participatory budgeting, and especially for sessions that are really centered on equity, one thing I just want to emphasize is that participatory budgeting is best understood as a framework. You can very much run through the mechanism of participatory budgeting and not necessarily yield the robust, equitable outcomes that you might assume might naturally come. If you want to see a practice that is deeply decolonial, or really is looking at settler colonialism in the context of land use, if you want to look at PB for racial justice and racial equity, then you have to bring that lens and that practice to the framework. And that has to be a very active part about what you do as you implement the work. And even thinking back to the conversation we had sort of just a bit ago, I think a bit of what I think, so our takeaways are just thinking about what are the kind of baseline assumptions we make when we consider the landscape of social spaces and decision making. And I think we have to understand to be okay and prepared to name that the baseline is going to skew towards preferencing and bolstering white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, right? We have to intentionally build a process that will overcorrect, undo, and bring a very different level of equity into the work. So a couple key considerations. We have to think about, is this money that matters? Is it an amount of money that matters to folks because we're asking them to volunteer, to weigh in, to go through a cycle, to do research with us, right? It could be a lengthy process. So is it worth their time and effort? Let's really honor that. But also, is it the kind of money that they have an interest in? If we want to get youth engagement, then let's talk about money that affects youth. We have to think about grassroots leadership. And I think a part of that from a municipal perspective means interrogating throughout the entire process how we're relating with power throughout the entire sort of phases of the work. And I think a part of that is recognizing that PB is really a grassroots-led process that needs to be intentionally supported by institutions. And so how that happens and how folks interrogate, where they see themselves maybe overstepping or being uncomfortable with relinquishing complete control and power is something to really keep in mind and really consider if you're able, and if you actually are, centering grassroots leadership throughout the entire process. That's really, really critical. Talking again about that baseline, if we understand that, this world is really skewed for participation, access for certain populations, we have to design for inclusion. We have to really think about how this could be different from electoral voting or electoral processes or more traditional processes. We have to really talk about outreach. Who are we reaching and how and why? And we have to not be afraid to name, if we're talking about something that disproportionately impacts our Black residents, then we need to name that and do intentional design outreach to address that. If we're talking about refugee, immigrant access, any number of things. And again, for those who are, formerly or currently incarcerated, they are members of our communities. What does it mean for us to include them in this process and do intentional outreach to facilitate that? We got to name it. We have to be specific. We have to be really honest. And it has to be a part of how we approach this work. And of course, equity, right? How do we name how equity shows up in the projects, in our selection of our steering committee members, in the selection of how we carry out the process from beginning to end? Incredibly critical. We have to be sort of a push and be brave about naming and being specific about what we mean, and then finding those resources to make it happen. This is slightly outdated, but I want to emphasize that PB is a very growing practice across the US and Canada. This kind of runs to 2019. We have to update it, but I think you'll probably even notice a huge boost in even the few years since between then and now. And I do want to offer just a couple examples like what we're actually seeing. I think sometimes people are like, that's nice, that's cute, but like, what does it actually look like in practice? So just a couple of things I want to just offer. We see participatory budgeting kind of being adopted and growing in communities of all sizes in all parts of the country, like I mentioned, even within organizations, all the way to large municipalities. In Boston, for example, I know a lot of folks are from Massachusetts. You might be familiar with the Youth Lead the Change process in Boston. That's a youth process where young leaders between the ages of 12 and 25 are allocating $1 million of capital money every single year. This last cycle, they collaboratively invested in renovations to a shelter for those who are unhoused. They invested in heating for school spaces so that students could really thrive in the winter. And they invested in greening their downtown and finding ways to both mitigate climate change, but also beautifying their commercial spaces. These are the things that young people are prioritizing. We've had the pleasure of seeing participatory budgeting grow in New York City and across New York State. New York has participatory budgeting incorporated into schools, incorporated across several districts within New York City, and then a movement to kind of expand that citywide across New York City, which is a huge kind of population municipal metro space. Over the last 10 years, as it's grown in New York, we've seen more investments led with participatory budgeting into schools and young people, into affordable housing, and into streets and transportation, things that a lot of elected municipal leaders really talk about wanting to prioritize anyway. And that's where people are really investing their time, money, and are using the outcomes of those investments more often, and are really feeling like they're building more trust, more relationships through that process. American Rescue Plan Act resources. Huge influx of money. We are seeing not only people implementing PB with those resources, Grand Rapids in Michigan is an example of that, but huge advocacy in places like Cleveland and other areas where people say, look, we have incredible disparities. This has to be a part of how we allocate those resources. So it's a growing space. We actually convened a coalition called Democracy Beyond Elections. It's a collaboratively held space that's leading a campaign about participatory budgeting and ARPA resources. We have some explainers about that if you're interested. And I also just want to acknowledge that, even things like jail closures, there's the Close the Workhouse campaign in St. Louis. There is also the closure of Men's Central Jail in Los Angeles County and other spaces when we're looking at alternatives to incarceration. A lot of demands are really coupling sort of these decarceral spaces and practices and saying community needs to decide what happens with this land, what happens with these salary savings, overhead savings. We want to facilitate the expansion of opportunity for our loved ones as they are being sort of released from these facilities into having the resources they need for a just recovery. A huge growing practice in sort of application of this work as well. Just a few examples. Happy to talk more. I think that probably brings me to time. And if you do have questions, I'll just say on our website, we do have resources that are really oriented around electeds, have really oriented around municipal leaders and folks who are interested in implementing a process like this. And again, also looking if you're interested in participatory democratic practices, policymaking, other pieces, we also have resources at democracybeyondelections.org as well.
Great, Kristania, thank you. I was going to ask you how people do reach out. How can they engage you? So there's the website there. We got several questions actually in only a couple of minutes, but one from the audience. You talk about participatory budgeting and laying out the process, designing the process. Do you worry about over engagement? Do you worry about sort of, community exhaustion on engagement, and keeping up with that all? How do you sort of handle that in designing the participatory budget process?
Yeah, so I will say survey fatigue, community weigh-in fatigue is very real. And I think a bit of why people get so frustrated is they're like, you were just here asking us what we thought about, and even like budget surveys, you asked us what we thought about our budget in this like 15-minute survey that I did that maybe wasn't even in my native language, and I still spent the time to do it, and I don't know what came of it. I don't know what happened. I don't know if you use any of my recommendations, and I know that none of that's binding. Like I don't know, what people do with that. And so part of why PB is a bit different, and part of why we do rely on really robust engagement, is because the outcomes are very clear. They're deeply transparent. They're led by community. We have to have that buy-in. So building that trust and kind of talking about that is actually really critical. But at the end of the day, that the fatigue, I think, diminishes because people are a part of both deciding where the money goes and also holding folks accountable for implementing their vision. And so I will say, in a context of PB where you have trusted relationships with community members, there's no such thing as too much engagement. We need those voices and that buy-in. That is the kind of the crux of what makes this work successful, but it has to come with transparency, and you've got to make sure that people actually do see the outcomes of their engagement. And I will say, if you do a robust process, they will make sure you do. That's
So
kind of the relationship building there.
So just one quick one. So, participatory budgeting existed before the pandemic. It's going to exist after it. What happened during it? Are there any nuggets of wisdom, any tools that you kind of threw out of the toolbox or put back in to go forward?
Yeah, I think PB will look very different post-pandemic than it did pre. A couple of things I think in terms of process and practice. I think that in the pandemic, we were relying a lot more on virtual engagement, and that does bring inherent inequities and disparities. And so we have seen a robust sort of set of resources and tools and infrastructure to allow for actually really nice digital engagement. That even cities like, I'll say New York, who've been doing this for a long time, they're like, wow, we saw actually a huge uptick in engagement on digital platforms over COVID from certain populations we typically don't even hear from, even like 10 to 11 years in. And we still need to open up spaces and incorporate sort of the things that work well with that in-person piece that are more accessible and don't rely on digital tech. So we've seen people actually buy and invest in infrastructure, pay for Wi-Fi, pay for tablets, to kind of bridge that a little bit. But I do think moving forward, we'll see a lot more hybrid models. People are needing to rely on both strong in-person engagement practices as well as like virtual pieces. But I also think that the landscape of how people do or don't address equity is kind of gone. I think that before, people are like, hey, it's about civics. This is about democracy. And yes, but not just. And I think that if you want to convene like a community steering committee and address their needs, but you're not prepared to have people say, hi, you've had a legacy of disinvestment in our community, and we want to talk about justice, and we want to talk about what this budget will or won't do because we got other policy needs. And if you're not able to kind of hold that space and have that conversation, I think probably pre-COVID, you may have been able to get away with it. And I don't think that people are able to convene in this way without being prepared and able and willing to go there. And I think you've got to be prepared to go there.
Great work. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. So we can move on to Ryan Bowers from Activist. Ryan, you're up. Come on screen. Get your presentation ready. Great.
All right.
All right. So it's 11:24. I think we're a little bit behind, but let's roll. Let's go.
Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm Ryan Bowers, co-founder with Activist, and excited to share a little bit about some of our work around looking at the equity of municipal budgets. All right. Activist, we're an investment research firm really looking at what does social risk look like in the municipal market? So we analyze racial, social, and economic justice risks in municipal finance. We really frame our work around a fiscal justice framework, which is really our intersectional approach to racial justice and fiscal health. Our thesis is really looking at the way that mispricing shows up in public finance, and that there's material investor risk and financial risk to cities that is largely mispriced and goes unnoticed, and really think about the ways that some municipal practices are neither good for investors nor residents. And so as we look at these kind of more unsavory corners of the municipal market, we're looking to highlight those, highlight that risk profile, really from a way that advances equity and inclusion. So much of our work can be kind of summed up in this kind of tension between balancing people over property and the negative consequences, unintended consequences that come up in kind of valuing property values and projects over people. And typically that ends up being people of color, immigrants, and other marginalized populations. Activist has 3 core bodies of work. One is our fiscal justice research. If you go to our website, activist.org, there's various research briefs, some on, you can see a recent report on the Flint water crisis, and an analysis of the water settlement bond that recently came to market. We've done some analysis on what does racial justice infrastructure look like, and there's also an upcoming report on looking at fiscal justice issues in Louisville, Kentucky, Louisville Metro government. We also provide investment research that fuels a municipal fiscal justice investment strategy that that is led by Adesina Social Capital and based on our data. And then thirdly, we organize municipal investors in engagement campaigns to engage issuers around highlighting issues of transparency and disclosure related to fiscal justice that show up across their budgets and financials. So I'm moving on to the next slide, budgeting for equity. So this budgeting equity for equity framework, we developed and piloted this probably a little over the past year or so, working with local governments to help them analyze the kind of fiscal health and equity implications of their budgets. And we started working with budget directors and finance managers from some of the largest cities across the country, large and mid-sized cities. And we've since used this with other webinars with electeds and city managers as well. And really kind of looking at these, these definitions that we include. What does fiscal health look like? What does equity look like? And thinking about why is this important to day-to-day practice. I want to move on and talk a little bit about what the actual framework looks like. So we're essentially using a growth share matrix. Those of you who are familiar with kind of management consulting, this is a very simple business tool, and this diagram shows what happens when equity and fiscal health aren't fully present or balanced from a program perspective. So we really use this to help local leaders go through their portfolio of programs and policies to think about the balance of equity outcomes and fiscal outcomes, and to really interrogate that portfolio. And this is an example from economic development. And essentially on the left, you have 4 different policies from opportunity zones, supplier diversity, local community loan programs, and tax abatements. And some of those are higher on fiscal outcomes, the degree that they contribute to the, the fiscal bottom line of a local government. And then also, from measuring them from low to high on equity outcomes, to the degree that they increase equity. And ideally in the top right quadrant, you want to have, you want to look at the high. What are the programs that in the economic development frame that both lead to high fiscal outcomes and high equity outcomes? Here we rank supplier diversity as high, and then the opposite side of the spectrum is tax abatements, which really have are as research shows, oftentimes lead to not very high, fiscal returns, but also tend to benefit one group of the population over the others. Here is another example using expenditure framework, and again, looking at this, universal pre-K is, kind of an evidence-based practice that, leads to high fiscal outcomes, very high ROI for return on investment, but also high equity outcomes for, the majority of your residents, particularly lower income residents in your municipality. Police settlements are on the other side of the spectrum, yielding low fiscal outcomes and low equity outcomes. And ActiveBest, we've led some bondholder engagement work in the city of Chicago and some other places to really get investors to, engage cities and city treasurers and controllers to look at what are the police settlement data, what information can investors use to make an informed decision about the level of risk that comes from police settlements. I'll use the anecdote from the city of Philadelphia, where we were working with the district attorney's office, and one of the things that they shared with us is that for every police settlement that is paid out by the city, there is that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a huge mountain of settlements that have never been processed, that don't have a dollar amount on them. So when you think about, the accounting and equity, looking at the backlog of unprocessed police settlements that don't show up in your annual financial report, it's a very subjective process from an accounting standards to really look at what settlements actually will likely turn into a payout, or what potential lawsuits will have a likelihood of being settled, and what those payout numbers are. And so it's one of the things that a number of cities are working towards, actually putting through new laws and ordinances that require the municipality to be transparent about not only those settlements that are paid out, but some of the kind of pending settlements or settlements that are still going through the courts. I want to talk a little bit about this accounting for equity framework, which is really a tool that we work with local governments with, and also counties, to look at key metrics that might be missing from their analysis to really understand what equity and inequity looks like in communities. And so this is really about both tallying up present practices and the cost of those. So as we think about where equity and inequity shows up, it's really starting to quantify that. What is if you could line up the thinking about the inequitable practices that cities engage in, and what are the costs? What is the cumulative impact across a portfolio of the foregone revenue or excessive costs that really lead to inequitable outcomes? So this is a kind of a template that we use that really starts to kind of quantifies really what those risks look like across a local government's portfolio. This example uses the domains of public safety, kind of balancing people and property, and public utilities. So for each of these, we have a different category that really lists the specific expense or revenue issue, the total amount of that, the type of risk, whether it is an expense or revenue, and then the up or down arrow showing the relative direction of risk. Is it increasing risk or is it decreasing risk? And then the details that talk more about what's the metric there, what's the metric to be used. So whether that's municipal assets, whether that's the amount of revenue abated, whether that's revenue brought in through fines and fees, we're really looking at the kind of relative direction of risk, much like a Moody's or an S&P rating outlook might have. And we have an example of this in a recent analysis that's about to come out on Louisville, Kentucky. And I think, if you go to our website, there's a link to a New York Times article that was released about a couple weeks ago that covered our Louisville Metro government analysis. So in this Louisville Metro example, we found recently that Louisville Metro, in their last year's financial statements, wasted about $119 million through expenditures and foregone revenues and activities that disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities. So these are really, list some of the policies and practices that created unnecessary costs and foregone revenues, while social services in Louisville remained largely underfunded. The cumulative impacts of this, near 119 million represents 13% of Louisville Metro's annual budget. And, one of these areas is around workforce and occupational taxes. So the city of Louisville receives about $900 million in income from tax dollars and other fees. The largest portion of that comes from occupational taxes collected from working residents, which totals about $432 million in 2019. With our analysis, we found that Louisville tax revenue from occupational taxes should be over $500 million, but due to underinvestment in the city's largely Black population over time, Blacks and Latinos, that population is underemployed, unemployed, underpaid, and had a lot fewer opportunities. So it's really the opportunity, not the opportunity cost, but the missed opportunity, missed revenue. The second area is public safety, and we're kind of zeroing in here on police settlements. Many of you are probably aware of Breonna Taylor's murder by Louisville police last year, which resulted in a record $12 million police settlement, and from the city of Louisville, and also a subsequent DOJ investigation, which now is in a consent decree that they're looking that is at least going to be $10 million a year, each year. In some of the analysis of Breonna Taylor's murder, and this is kind of combining where municipal practice can lead to these kind of outsized costs. In the Elliott Avenue area where Breonna was shot, there's been documented efforts to evict low-income, mostly Black residents to make way for new developments as part of the Vision Russell City Plan. And this is really a highlight of this practice of using development-driven policing. There was actually kind of an experimental police unit that coordinated with the Economic Development Department that was trying to clear property and focus on really pursuing, low-level violations to make way for new development. And this is where this practice of, lockstep economic development and policing can lead to some really precarious outcomes for people of color. Louisville also has a kind of history of very extractive tax increment financing, and the most recent example, there was a huge kind of debacle with the TIF district that funded the Yum Center Arena, which there was a recent audit by the Kentucky auditor that found that the revenue projections from the TIF district put the city in a terrible financial position. These revenue projections were way off, and a lot of the accountability and transparency that involved with that deal is now coming into public light. Just this year, in the past few months, Louisville Metro government is now added again with another large TIF district. This time, they are making the entire West End, which is where the majority of Black residents in all of Kentucky live, in the West End of Louisville, Kentucky, where they're seeking to make the entire West End a TIF district over the next 20 years. And it's governed by an oversight body that is led by developers that have clear conflicts of interest. And so we're working with some local organizers and other key stakeholders that are trying to really highlight the issue that there is so little transparency and kind of disclosure around this TIF deal that was really, passed through in record time and signed by the governor's office. And again, this leads to more negative ROI for Black and Brown populations. And a repeat of some of the same negative subsidies that were started with the Yum deal. So as a bottom line, despite Louisville's AA credit rating, there's Louisville really has the makings of a failed democracy, with this vicious cycle of historically rooted systems of divestment and exclusion of schools, housing, and unemployment opportunities that cement racialized inequalities over time, evidenced through occupational taxes and public safety and economic development spending. That's really, I'll wrap up my remarks there and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, there are. Thanks, Ryan. Great remarks. And it struck me as you were talking with Christania's sort of public process and sort of your analytical approach to this thing. The two presentations were really thoughtful. If you could go back to your first framework slide for a second, I want to ask you a question about the outcomes there. Very interesting. Yeah, that one there. Yeah, there you go. So Catherine reminded me that yesterday there was a House Oversight Committee hearing on opportunity zones, and I guess there was a pretty good discussion about the benefits and whether it's working or not. So I'm curious. There's a program that was designed, ostensibly to attract investment into areas that need it. I'm curious as to why it scores the way it does on this analysis. High net fiscal outcome, but not a high equity outcome. Talk to us about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I remember when opportunity zones were coming out. The legislation. I think Cory Booker was really leading the pack there, and so you see a very progressive senator coming from Newark, New Jersey, and it has on its face it has all the makings of a progressive kind of equitable policy. One of the details, and some of the details that have come out since then are one that opportunity zones are really it is this almost kind of trickle down model where you're really supporting place-based investment by the wealthiest private equity firms and developers to target low-income communities. And one of the unintended consequences that a number of people reported in, there's an organization called Good Jobs First, which are probably the kind of preeminent research firm that looks at corporate subsidies and tax abatements, and they look at some of the unintended consequences of these. They found that opportunity zones largely lead to a major tax subsidy that is you see the largest impact at the state level. And I can probably share some documents from Good Jobs First after this, but it's really generally states are missing out on these kind of on tax subsidies from the opportunity zone, and what they're realizing is that the benefits in some ways aren't actually outweighing the cost, the cost to state revenues. So there's the subsidies really accrue value and benefit to mostly the investors at the expense of state revenues. And I think my co-founder at Activist, Napoleon Wallace, was formerly Deputy Director of Economic Development for the state of North Carolina, and he actually oversaw the creation of the State Opportunity Zone program. And this was early on when it was the legislation was freshly inked, and folks weren't completely sure of what the unintended impacts were. They knew that this was just a quickly moving opportunity to really marshal tons of outside investment to these very poor overlooked census tracts. But now that it's starting to come out, some of the unintended consequences of this, and I think again, it is actually something that is often not kind of talked about as really the thing that's focused most is on the new dollars that are brought, but the question is at what cost?
Right, and in LOCUS, as most people probably on this call know, that LOCUS's work in this space when opportunity zones first came out, promoting it, doing some research. We convened up here in Massachusetts the Opportunity Zone Academy for I think there were 6 cohort communities that participated in how to take that program and sell it and implement it at the local level. So I'm interested in your research, and if you could share some of that with the LOCUS staff, that'd be very helpful as we continue on. So appreciate it, Ryan. Nice job. Thank you. Chris, you are up next. Hello.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Let me
Take it away.
All righty, thank you. I'm going to try and make up a little bit of time. Generally, I'm going to talk about the Massachusetts context, housing production, and the legislative reforms that have happened. Today is actually the anniversary, my 4-year work anniversary of working on the Housing Choice Initiative. So happy anniversary to me. And I want to say that I'm really humbled to be part of this panel, learning as I, kind of continue my journey in understanding equity a little bit more. So thank you very much for the opportunity. So we've already talked about the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. For the Massachusetts folks on the call, you're all very aware of this. But what that means is that, as we spoke earlier, there's 351 independent zoning jurisdictions. My colleagues at the Mass Housing Partnership have put together this map that just kind of illustrates for my colleagues on the call from around the country. Here are 38 cities and towns in Massachusetts that equal the population of Fairfax County, Virginia. And so we're in Fairfax County, Virginia, you have 1 board of supervisors. In Massachusetts, you've got 38 cities and towns making independent decisions. So that just shows the issues that we have here about small scale decision making. And again, as I spoke earlier, no big surprise, local zoning are barriers to equity, especially in equitable access to housing. And so I'm just going to bring us down to the housing space as opposed to the budget space. But in the last 30 years in Massachusetts, we have had not a lot of multifamily built, except for the state statute that we have called Chapter 40B, the anti-snob zoning that's been around for 50 years. Communities have downzoned and continue to have large lot zoning. There's little consideration of regional or statewide needs at the local level. And that means the result of that is it's growing inequity for people of color and people of lower incomes. For those of you on the call, you may have heard me, Secretary Keneally, Governor Baker talk about this. This is one of the main issues that we have is in Massachusetts. In the last generation, we have a lack of housing production. Between 1960, which is the year on the left, and 2017 is the year on the right, the bar in the middle, or the dotted line here in the middle, is right at 1990. So between 1960 and 1990, we built the state as a whole built almost 900,000 housing units. But since 1990, again, the last generation, the last 30 years, we've built less than half of that. Here in this chart, we have single family as the yellow and multifamily is the gray. And so you can see there were years where there was just extensive production of housing, and that has slowed to a trickle. The other thing that I'd like to talk about is access to transit. And this map is showing the commuter rail lines, and it's focusing on the commuter rail lines. And this is from a publication that came out about a year ago called Zoned Out: Why Massachusetts Needs to Legalize Multifamily Near Transit, which was a report put out by the Boston Indicators Project and the Brookings Institute. So a local Massachusetts research think tank and a national research institution. So here we're showing the commuter rail lines shown in purple here with all the stops. And right here, we're looking at the income. So Boston is, this is a spoken hub system, and Boston is the center with outlying suburbs. In particular to the west, having high incomes and also having good access to transit, which provides them access to jobs. In many cases, the end of the commuter rail line is in what we call a gateway city. These are cities like Worcester, Lowell, Fitchburg, Haverhill, and other gateway cities that are cities that have lost manufacturing and lost and have lower incomes in general. So here is this access to transit, and you start to see what I'm talking about in these gateway cities where there's high proportions of Black or Latinx population. And then you can see in the suburbs where we had that higher income, we have very low proportions of Black and Latinx population. And finally, unfortunately, the unemployment mirrors the higher percentages of Black and Latinx is also the higher percentages of unemployment. Again, with the suburban areas, especially, it's just surrounding Boston, all around kind of in a ring, having lower unemployment, significantly lower unemployment, but continuing to have the access to transit. So when I talk about housing and I talk about equity in Massachusetts, there's lots of data that shows why we have one of the highest housing prices in the country. We're competing. We like to be number one in many things in the Commonwealth. We don't like to be number one in the high cost of housing, but we are. So the data is very clear, but I like to bring it back and when I'm talking to people, is thinking about your residents. Does your community have the housing stock that it needs to address the needs of current and future residents? We have current residents that are aging. We all know the baby boom is a very large generation, and their housing needs are different and will continue to be different as people are living now well past the age of 85, and those folks just need special housing. They don't need large housing. They don't need large lots to take care of. They need small housing units. And unfortunately, we have not been building a lot of smaller housing units in Massachusetts. We have we have young professionals, we have multi-generation families, we have single parents, we have people who are living on their own. Those are the needs of the population that we all should be planning for, but unfortunately have not all across Massachusetts have we planned for that. So again, as I said, I just started 4 years ago to the day. I started my job running the Housing Choice Initiative. This was Governor Baker, the Baker-Polito administration's initiative to try and address and confront the housing crisis that's been facing the state. One of the things was that Governor Baker set forward a goal of producing 135,000 new units between 2018 and 2025. That's about 17,000 units a year. There was also legislation, which I'm going to detail. We created a program that is a reward-based program, which is if you are a community that is building housing, you qualify for a housing choice designation, and you also qualify for a grant program that will give you capital dollars to help your community. And then in the last 4 years, I've been coordinating with other housing agencies in Massachusetts and nonprofits to better coordinate the grants and technical assistance that we're providing to communities. So the housing choice legislative reform that changed Chapter 40A, that's the state's Zoning Enabling Act. The main goals was to make it easier to approve housing zoning amendments. In Massachusetts, for the last 100 years, as again, Massachusetts officials will know well, you need what's called a supermajority to pass zoning amendments. That's a 2/3 vote or 67% vote. For my colleagues who are budget officials, we pass budgets, hundreds of millions of dollars of budgets with a simple majority vote. But to change zoning, you'd need the 67%. And frankly, that was stopping really good pro-housing or housing-friendly zoning from taking effect. And that was a stopper in both towns that have town meetings and also in cities. Another major change that's part of the housing choice legislative reform that was in the Economic Development Bond Bill is to link transit access to higher density housing. And there's a whole new section was put into Chapter 40A, into the Zoning Act, that requires the MBTA communities, that's 175 communities, to have at least one multifamily zoning district with 15 units an acre that would be permitted by right. That is, there's no discretionary approval, no special permit approval. And if you don't have that multifamily zoning district, you'll lose access to funding like MassWorks and the Housing Choice Program and the Special Projects Fund, which is actually our gaming receipts from the gaming from our casinos. And there were definitely other pro-housing modifications as well. again, one of the main things was to change the threshold of vote. So we chose about 8 different kinds of zoning amendments that could qualify for a simple majority vote. So still many kinds of zoning amendments in Massachusetts will take that 2/3 vote, supermajority vote. But if you want to upzone areas, you want to, by, like, let's say, reducing dimensional requirements, like reducing lot size to increase density, or if you want to adopt Chapter 40R smart growth zoning, if you want to allow accessory dwelling units by right, many different kinds of pro-housing zoning amendments now require only a simple majority.
Chris, one second. Total apologies. Keep going. Not going to stop you, but I do want to say we're going to go about 5 minutes more, if possible, please. If folks want to, I understand your time's precious. We did go a little bit over. So, 12:05 will be our stop. Just want to make sure people know that, but keep going because this is good stuff, and we have lots of questions. Okay.
Thanks very much.
All right,
and
sorry about that.
I'm a natural fast talker, so I'm trying my best. Again, this new section,
you're doing great.
which is the MBTA communities section, is really, and I want to just stay here again for my colleagues from across the country. This is some of the most radical, progressive land use reform in the country. California has been working for a long time to try and get transit-oriented development easier to approve near transit stations. In Massachusetts, this was signed by the governor in January. And so again, working on these 15 units an acre multifamily districts, they have to be suitable for families with children. They need to be located near commuter rail, or near transit stations. If you have transit stations, for the communities that don't have transit stations, the guidance will outline what you need to do. So we are currently working on that guidance. So I'm sorry, I won't be able to answer any questions about it, but it should be out by the end of this calendar year. So the the housing choice designation that I talked about, it only is available to communities that have been building housing over the last 5 years by increasing by 5% or 3%, and then having zoning and equitable best practices. There are currently 78 housing choice designations, and as you can see, most of these are in the general eastern Massachusetts area. It is a designation that changes over time, but it is open every year for communities to apply. As I said, there's a grant program to reward these communities. So they're only competing against 80 communities, for example, whereas our other capital grant programs, communities have to, you're competing against 351 communities. So here's some examples of improvements in Amherst and Framingham. These are communities that have been building housing and building housing in the right places, and they're getting money to fund capital projects. So I just want to leave you with this image, which is just to say that as we're looking at equity in housing, the housing choice legislation, the zoning reform, the capital grant program that I run, these are all just pieces of the puzzle. There are many, many other things that go into creating equitable housing, supporting extremely low income, making sure transportation options are available, using other funding sources such as federal and HUD funds like community development block grants and other state grants, promoting best practices like mixed use, accessory dwelling units, having communities in Massachusetts that use the Community Preservation Act to fund housing projects or to fund changes to zoning. And also, of course, working with community partners such as community development corporations and other nonprofits that are all part of the puzzle. So just to leave you, like budgeting, housing is very complex. The equity, trying to improve equity and access to jobs and transportation is difficult. But in my last 4 years, I can say that I have seen some movement, and I think that we're moving in the right direction here in Massachusetts. And that's what I got.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. And if everyone else could come back on screen for just a few minutes. Chris, nuts and bolts question for you. Is MassWorks tied to the housing choice designation? Meaning if those, if you're not in that pool, are you eligible for MassWorks?
Of course you are. Yes, all communities are eligible for MassWorks. One of the benefits of being a housing choice community is that you do get some special consideration from grant programs. So if you're a housing choice community and you're applying for MassWorks, there are some bonus points that are applied to you. So it's not, but it doesn't preclude, non-housing choice communities from competing.
Okay.
The legislation ties MassWorks to the MBTA communities and the new zoning, the new multifamily zoning. And so that is a place where if the community does not comply with that requirement, ultimately, and again, the guidance is coming about when compliance will be needed and what you have to do for compliance. But if you choose not to comply with that, then you will lose access to applying for MassWorks.
Okay. And I'm sure LOCUS would be happy to help roll out some of that guidance and when it comes forward. Thank you. So we have touched on land use here quite a bit in the budget process. And I know, Chris, trying to tie what you just talked about in terms of fiscal impact, traditionally the conventional wisdom has been multifamily housing creates children in school, but school stress, right? I've been in this planning business, public and private sector, for a long time. Is that a myth? And when I think that pendulum has swung, and from a fiscal analysis point of view, doesn't multifamily pay itself? Isn't there a net benefit?
So I'm going to answer the question with just some data facts. As I mentioned, the baby boom as a generation that is aging now, and because we have very good healthcare, certainly here in Massachusetts, the baby boom is lasting longer. The other part of that is that there are fewer children. And this is a general demographic trend, but it is true across Massachusetts, with some exceptions of communities that have exceedingly high performing schools where families are going to those communities. In general, communities are looking at a decline in enrollment across the board. And so one of the things in the community, I was a community development director in a community in Metro West Boston, and we had 3 40B projects, 3 multifamily projects all come across our desks at one time. I met with the school committee and talked to them about the impact, and their reaction was, well, this is good because we were looking at closing an elementary school unless we have more children. So one of the major things about just this demographic fact of declining enrollment is that communities may be looking at having to consolidate school services because children are actually declining.
But does that take away the argument against multifamily housing?
I think it does. It's just, it's very difficult. We've talked, Christina talked a lot about participatory processes. First of all, zoning is complex and people don't understand how zoning works because even if you have a multifamily district does not mean that you're going to get a multifamily building. And so, it's you can't predict that. But it's just, it's very difficult to communicate that to the public and parents who are concerned about their child's schoolroom and what it's going to look like. So I do think it's a fact, but whether or not people who are voting or people who are participating in decisions understand that is another story.
So we have a minute left. I want to do a speed round, okay? So keep your interest to 15, 20 seconds or so. We'll start with Jan, and same question for everybody. So start thinking about it. What are the metrics of success for equity and budgeting, and some of the tools that you've made? What are your metrics for success?
Well, the results. I mean, the well-being, the quality of life results for all of our population, that they aren't so divergent.
Ryan.
I would say, to borrow from Christiana's work, it's the amount of budget and resources that are driven by residents who are most impacted. That's a major indicator, and I'd say the other one is really quality of life years. I think that's a huge indicator because there's such a gap in mortality and the length of life.
Christina.
I'll plus one what's been said, and I'll just say, success is when where you live isn't determined how long you live, when, the conditions of your home, your well-being, your thriving isn't dependent upon, your race, your background, other things like that. And we have really open access that's achieved, I think, through participation and leadership by communities. And I think is also then measured, to Jan's point, around like those outcomes. What is that yielding? Are we really thriving, wholly across our communities and really engaged in that work?
Communicate the process and communicate the results, for sure. Chris, last word.
Echo what everybody else said, but also say, is there equitable access? Is there access to jobs, transportation, and housing? And those are, as everybody has said, those are key determinants in health, long life, vitality. And are all of our communities doing that? And is it not just focused on a couple communities, but are all communities?
All right. Well, 2 hours has flown by again on these things. Unbelievable session. Great discussion, great feedback. Thank you guys very much. West Coast, East Coast, Philly, go Eagles, I guess. I don't know. No. Okay, so thanks again to LOCUS, Smart Growth America, and the Barr Foundation. And the next session, again, the bonus session on zoning reform for equity is going to be on December 15th at 10 a.m. same time. And please sign up for that. And again, for the attendees, look for the recordings of these sessions coming your way. With that, we'll say goodbye and thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Jim.